Right, so here we are again, Nick. Another really interesting discussion. I really value these discussions with you. We started off talking about how do we both feel about the Starmer situation
Hmm.
broadly. We then had a discussion about what we thought was driving it. Um, and now I think it's important. One of the themes that came out of this was you're passionate about accountability. And it's certainly something that's important to me, but I think there's something about trying to understand um, and clarify what it is to be British. And I think that's uniquely difficult because it's a bit like your hair growing, you don't really notice. So
Hmm.
let's have a go at doing that. Um,
I'm really
and
looking
let's then,
forward to this conversation because this is a conversation I've not had before verbally with somebody. I've
yeah,
had this conversation many times in my head. So I'm hoping to
yeah,
learn from this and be able to express myself better next time I have this conversation.
yeah. And I think that's the great thing about these calls because it forces a certain amount of discipline,
Hmm.
and it forces you to get your thoughts together. And actually, I think what's interesting, probably you and I come from very different sort of backgrounds. I'm a sort of pretty unusual sort of public school boy. So I came up through that sort of British route, and you came. What was your schooling like? Was it public school or local
My,
school or
my school, you wouldn't believe my schooling. I went to a failing state comprehensive school
right?
where one of my teachers was stabbed 42 times in the chest. Another
Wow,
female teacher was sexually abused several times by gangs of lads. I could
wow.
walk from one classroom to another classroom through the hole in the wall where kids had kicked the breeze blocks out of the wall. That was my schooling.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you wouldn't believe the level of brutality what went on where the extraordinary things that went on where I. But anyway, I think that's really helpful actually because we're coming at this from completely different perspectives, and let's relish that. So
Mm.
over to you, Nick. I thought what we could talk about, discuss what it is to be British, then talk a bit about the threats to that as we see it, and then talk about what we might do about that afterwards. So over to you, sir.
Yeah.
2 minutes.
What does it mean to be British? I think that is almost an unanswerable question, unless the answer is somebody who believes in the union. Um, as time has gone on this last decade, I found myself calling myself more and more English rather than British,
Yeah,
and I've done that for many reasons. That's because the four parts of the UK are different, and that's fantastic. We don't have to be all the same. In the referendum 10 years ago in Scotland, 45% of the population voted to leave the union, so they didn't feel British.
yeah,
So I'm not sure what Britishness is. The government basically says this. I've just Googled what the British government says, what Britishness is. And they say it's democracy, rule of law, liberty, and respect and tolerance. So some things we can agree with: rule of law, democracy. But when we start getting to respect and tolerance, that's just mumbo jumbo,
yeah,
pink and fluffy, trying to find something that makes us British.
yeah,
If the question is, what is Englishness? I think that's probably a more valued discussion. I think so. What is Englishness? People struggle to define what Englishness is because the first point is Western Europe and North America. We have slowly over the last 50, 60 years become slowly and slowly more like each other.
yeah,
So that's not helps because we watch the same TV programs basically. We all speak English now. Our most amazing gift to the world, we gave them our language. We follow the same sports. Let's be honest, England gave the world nearly all its sports.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and I think that's why we find it harder and harder to define who we are. If I had to then go beyond that, so what is Englishness to me? Englishness to me is basically little things and some big things. So let's do the big things first. The big things would be rule of law,
yeah,
and that's underpinned by our sense of fair play. So
yeah,
the rule of law enforces our innate sense of fair play.
yeah,
It doesn't matter if you're a duke, a lord, the king. Everybody has to follow the law. You cannot use your power, your influence to tyrannize somebody else. I'm sure that goes on. Of course it does, because we're not perfect. But we have the rule of law that tries to stop that. And we fail at that sometimes, such as the post office submaster scandal.
Yeah.
Where we treated those people horrendously and everybody knew what was going on and nobody wanted to tackle it for personal convenience.
Yeah.
So we let ourselves down sometimes. But the fact when that scandal was made into a drama on TV and the whole population saw it, things changed the next day because it went against our sense of fair play.
Yeah.
The next thing is democracy. Democracy in this country, well, democracy across the world is basically an experiment. You know, it's only been going on 100 years. People think we've had democracy forever.
Yeah.
We haven't. It's been 100 years. It's basically been since just after the First World War. So 1918 was when working class men got the right to vote. 10 years later, women got the right to vote.
Yeah.
So it's 100 years, but that's an important 100 years. And you can call it an ideology, but our culture now is hooked onto democracy and we think it's the bee's knees, basically. Whether or not it is or not is a different discussion for another day.
Yeah.
But that's part of Englishness, and you'd say Britishness as well, democracy, that we get to vote in our leaders.
Yeah.
That was part of the reason why we never liked the EU. That was part of the reason why we wanted to leave the EU, because it wasn't democratic enough for us. People we didn't vote in were making laws and decisions that affected us, and we could not get rid of them.
Yeah.
That wasn't democracy.
Yeah.
And then some of the small things, which some people may laugh at, but some of the, I mean, if you've done a lot of traveling around the world, these are little things that jump out at you where you think, oh, we don't do that in England. The first one is queuing.
Yeah.
I know it's a joke. People make, you know, it's in sitcoms, but it's actually very true. You know, I've been around. I remember being stored at a bus station in Israel, in Jerusalem, queuing to buy a bus ticket, and I left a 6-inch gap between me and the woman in front of me because I didn't want to be right up against her, because that's like sexual harassment. And because I left a 6-inch gap, another woman forced herself in and stood in front of me.
Yeah.
And she didn't think she'd done anything wrong.
Yeah.
Because, well, that's not a queue. A queue is where there's a gap, you stand in the gap.
Yeah.
But we don't do that here. I remember when I went skiing in France 20 years ago, queuing up for the ski lifts. Only the English were queuing. Everybody else was trying to walk to the front of the queue and push in.
Right.
So that goes to our sense of fair play.
Yeah.
That goes to the sense of we need to be orderly. We need to get what we deserve. And when you've been in line, that means you're next to be served.
Yeah.
And it's also about manners. You know, how many other countries in the world does somebody bump into you and then you turn around in an instant and apologize to them for them bumping into you?
Yeah.
And that's because we have manners, and manners may seem trivial and silly to some people, but what manners is all about is keeping harmony in the tribe.
Yeah.
It's about making sure you don't get to conflict. So it's all about that social cohesion. Hence why 150 years ago we ruled the world.
Yeah.
Not because of manners, but because we had a cohesive society that was going down the same path.
Yeah.
And the next thing about Englishness, and you could say Britishness as well, about why we find it hard to define it, you only can define those terms when the majority of the country all agree.
Yeah.
Hence why the government have come out with 4 values that are so wishy-washy. You'd have the Maori tribe in New Zealand agreeing with it. You'd have the Kenyan bush people agreeing with those points because they're so vague and nebulous.
Yeah.
But they have to be vague and nebulous now because we're a fractured society. And it's very hard to get us to agree on anything. Hence why we find it very hard to define what Englishness is and what Britishness is, because we're not one people anymore. We're being fragmented into tribes.
Yeah, really interesting. One of the things that came to mind, and I think maybe part of the reason why Englishness or Britishness is difficult to define is because it's predicated around freedom. Christianity, oddly enough, which is the bedrock of a lot of where the cultures come from. It's all around freedom. It's people think that Christianity is actually bolting you down, but actually the handle is on our side of the door. And so that's probably got something to do with the challenge in defining what is British. I think you're absolutely right. We have accepted norms, some of which are fundamental truths. I mean, some of the thing, like which are actually biblical. So things like nationhood, what's male and female, um, infant, adult, good, evil, all of those things, which are things that shouldn't change, Nick. That
Mm.
they're basically the bedrock. So the progressives, oddly enough, of course, attacking that because even the word progressive is misleading. It's misleading because it's not progressive. It's definitely moving us backwards because you can see the outcomes of what's
Yeah.
going on. And family as well. Family is absolutely vital to the structure of society, all of which are under attack. So I think there's the bedrock type things. Then there's the sort of nice to have refinements, like queuing. I think that's absolutely uniquely British.
Mm.
Um, I think the difficulty we're faced with is, um, and I think there's also truth, and you know, truth is really important. So psychologically, if people are breaking these things which we consider to be truthful, which the unchangeable things, then that should really grate on us, right? Because we're being forced out of shape. We're being forced to believe something that's and act out something that's untrue. So, a lot of this rainbow related stuff,
Mm.
that type of corruption, and or attacking families, that sort of thing. I think the other point you made as well, which is the importance of truth in resolving issues. So you mentioned the postmaster situation, which was just the most extraordinary scandal. And I think actually that's one of the strange thing about the British culture. I used to have a tenet. I ran a team, and they were one of the things that occurred to me was that politeness is a form of dishonesty to a degree, because effectively you're wrapping up the truth in a digestible sort of way. So it's a bit of an exaggeration to make the point, but I think there is a danger in the sort of nice, polite UK culture, of not facing the truth. But you can see as the postmaster situation, um, illustrated when you do present the truth, you get an instant reaction. When you get to the truth, then the solution becomes very clear. And I
Mm.
talk about this actually in terms of strategy in organizations. If you focus on the truth, strategy becomes very simple. If you follow all the rest of this ideological stuff, which you and I have talked about in the
Mm.
past, then of course that's taking people's eyes off the ball and creating a huge distraction. And at its very simplest level, what people are talking about tends to be all of that stuff, all of that corruption, and the sort of bending of the truth, let's say, or bending of the distinctions. People use the word distinction. Um, I think the other challenge for this is that, and I think, to be honest, we are being invaded on all fronts. And invasion is a word that I've decided to start using, Nick, because it's sort of truthful, I think, because we've got a prime minister which frankly is traitorous. He's actually advocating. One of the things in our last discussion, I think, which is very clear to me. I follow the psychology. The psychology all the way through is the WEF, psychology and ideology, which Starmer blindly follows. So if you look at why, I don't question whether or not taking money away from pensioners is right or wrong, which of course it's wrong. But if you understand the psychology, there's consistency to that, which is around nationhood. And of course, pensioners are, our greatest national asset. They are people who have got us to where we have got to. And of
Mm.
course, to marginalize those people actually fits, unfortunately, with the WF ideology. And so that if you look for these consistencies, you can see this corruption. But I think we're and so I think we're being invaded by the government. I think they're being traitorous. That emboldens, the people who don't value the things that you and I have just talked about. We've got people coming into the country that have no knowledge, of what they're coming into, apart from selfish reasons. We've got a
Mm.
I think financial aspects in any situation actually what are the acid test of sanity. There are 1.6 million immigrants in the UK, who are living on benefits, and only 5% of them are economically productive, which
Mm.
there's a clearly that's practically not sustainable. So I think um, and fundamentally one of the distinctions and truths is around nationhood, valuing nationhood. Um, and I think we need to address the issue of Islam as well. And it's interesting actually. Islam started off quite peacefully and got nowhere, and then it turned violent, and then it got somewhere. And I think um, there's an element of deception there, which they call aberration or whatever they call it, in terms of the beginning and the end verses. And I think the WF and Co. What would if they could take over our nation without war, then that would be preferable. And I think we are facing an onslaught um, of these things. And I think the other thing that occurred to me, which is equally disturbing, is actually role models, Nick. So who is a atypical role model of Britishness? And you and I are pretty ordinary guys who care about this, but I think what the Queen was a pretty extraordinary example of what it is to be British and exemplified all the things you just talked about. Um, in her own imperfect way. I think someone like John Harvey Jones was in his own rather peculiar way, typifying British industry, supporting British interests, those sorts of things, as opposed to all this net zero stuff, which is just handing the keys to China. Um, and I think, if you look at specifically that again in terms of treachery, Khan putting up that plinth on in Trafalgar Square that put
Mm.
that trans statue up on, that was actually intended to be for the Queen. Do you know that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are these intentional things which I think are really troubling. But what I do, and I completely agree, the basis of any negotiation, any peaceful discussion, is to identify what are the unifying values, Nick. So in our discussions, you and I have discussed unifying values, and freedom is an interesting one, but freedom actually requires effort. Victimhood doesn't require any effort. So the Starmer ideology requires no effort, no accountability, no responsibility. No, you can see in the way he avoids questions, even his own questions about the number of deaths of pensioners, it's blatant. So that with freedom, there comes accountability, and it's relatively hard. And you can actually teach people out of freedom, because if the education system is teaching the opposite, uh, that's a big issue.
And
Um,
then don't forget, freedom isn't free.
exactly,
Freedom is paid for by the blood of patriots.
absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's really hard fought for. Um, yeah, absolutely. But I think it's something. If you're given the choice, right? If you're given the choice, uh, it requires effort, it requires training, it requires resilience, it requires all the things that I learned when my public. I mean, like your schooling, Nick. Your schooling was tough for a different reason to mine. I mean, I really got the sport. A lot of things when I was at school really was quite pretty violent, and there were some pretty unpleasant people, and they were, extremely violent, frankly. And you learned how to survive. And when I came out of my public school education, I went into a factory, actually, oddly enough, and I worked on the shop floor, and I was promoted to supervisor because I could cope. And I remember the first thing that someone said to me, said, "Look, if the old boss comes to me and tells me how to run this machine, I'll shove his head in the machine." That was the sort of nature, and that's the sort of pièce de resistance. So I think there's a degree to which the schooling taught us to cope with difficult situations and gave us that accountability, and also um, that interest in taking responsibility for ourselves, paying for our children, all of which has been seriously damaged, I think, through COVID. Because one of the things I think that is problematic in this equation is that you can, through habit, teach people socialism and reliance on victimhood, which I think a lot of people who are quite entrepreneurial, quite happy to accept money from the government, when they took their freedom away, which is no, that is not a passive action. That is actually, uh, moving us back as close as you can to socialism across the nation. So I think there's a habitual aspect which has been problematic for the UK. So yeah, I think what
I think socialism has been happening to this country since the end of the Second World War. Because during the Second World War, the government ran everything. And we came out of the Second World War, Labour were elected and just carried on. We had a blip in the 80s, it was called Thatcherism. But
sure,
apart from that blip, we've had more and more socialism every single decade. And because we're a tribal creature, people want protection. People want the tribal leader to look after them, to
yeah,
give them resources. And it's human nature. Socialism is built into our DNA, but
yeah,
only at a tribal level when it's 50 to 100 people. Socialism doesn't work when you get to the macro level, when it's a nation state. And we've seen this. And COVID's shown us again, all you have to do is scare the people and they will give away their rights overnight because they're afraid.
yeah,
And to a certain extent, it makes sense because what's the point of being free and dead
yeah,
when you can give away your rights and you're still living? So it's a survival strategy. And many dictators across the world use this all the time. That's why every dictator in the world is always at war with a neighbor because
yeah,
he has to make sure his people are more afraid of the enemy than him.
yeah. I think that's absolutely right. I think as well that it becomes in this type of environment, Nick, it becomes increasingly difficult. And I talked a bit about the invasion on multi fronts, which I think is a fair statement. I'm willing to take responsibility for that statement. Um, but I think, in that situation, it becomes increasingly difficult to stick your head above the parapet, and it becomes a lot easier to follow the prevailing narrative.
Mm.
And which is the reason, and this is the reason why companies. This is the reason why I understand this psychology, because this is why companies go bust. This is why the cover up of the grooming gangs and all around fear of talking about rape. It's the reason why the post office scandal was covered up because people hadn't got the truth. And actually, I worked in Lloyd's Bank just before it went bust, and I was looking at risk in Lloyd's Bank, and they hadn't. It was systemic. There was a systemic blindness and lack of truth, Nick, in the organisation where um, they weren't even looking for they weren't even looking or challenging these things. So, and I think you know, there's a degree to which, and one of my traits is I tend to, I mean, humour's a great British trait which we haven't mentioned. I think it's very
Mm.
important because it breaks things up. And I think you know you've got to sort of, and I think humour is a very powerful tool to level things out, but truth is an even more powerful tool.
Mm.
But I think I talk about this in my book. The problem with this is right is that if you stick your head above the parapet, right, and talk about the things which actually are really problematic. So a lot of this stuff happening at national level is really problematic, but there's much more problematic things. And I'll tell you one thing, which is actually in law, right? The COVID, one of the tenets of the World Economic Forum is to population reduction,
Mm.
right? Now, one thing that not many people know, but this is actually in law. It was US defined because we'd been contaminated with mRNA, right, as human beings. We defined us as not being human beings. Therefore, we don't have human rights anymore. Did you know that?
No.
That is not known very well. There's another thing where I need to find the source of this, but which is dig it out. But the assets and shares are all being switched to the central um, uh, no technocrats, so that actually when and as the CBDC happens, owning nothing and being happy uh, is oddly enough just a question of flicking a switch. So we're talking about this stuff, but actually, what the point I'm making, right, regardless if you agree with those two
Mm.
things, right, doesn't particularly matter. In the background, the way they maintain this psychosis is to talk about escalating worse things, which become even more difficult to face, even though they may be true. And people then naturally can't digest that. They put it in a box. Well, Tom's this, or Nick's that, and that's the reason why. That's the reason why Hitler, managed to exterminate the Jews, because it sort of got to the point whereby people, were not willing to accept the mantle of freedom and accountability and the things we're talking about. And they moved into this socialist mindset. We just need to go with this and see what happens. Which, to a degree, I'd fit in a friendly way. I'd challenge your thinking on this, my friend, because you rightly sort of, well, your view was last time we spoke was, no, the Labour government will have their way and it'll crash and we'll have to pick up the pieces type mentality
Yeah.
or psychology. There's a bit of a challenge to that, is that governments, if we let that happen, governments never willingly give up things they've already enshrined in law. So if we want to reverse, we let this thing take its course, it becomes very difficult, because you actually have to revolt against these things to actually reverse, to get a government to give it back to you around free speech, let's say, or some
You
other bit
do,
of
but
legislations.
when you've built your ideology, your government, your ideas, your philosophy, when you've built it on sand, it may look tremendous, but it won't last because you built it on sand.
Yeah,
Who would have thought, if you was a Jew in 1939, you thought Hitler was unbeatable. We thought Hitler was unbeatable.
yeah,
Eastern Europeans, when the Iron Curtain fell, thought this is going to last forever.
yeah,
It fell without a shot being fired.
yeah,
So when you build it all on sand, things can come tumbling down very quickly.
yeah,
Hence why I'm not too worried about the state of affairs in the UK at the moment. We will get through this because we've got through worse situations.
yeah.
A couple of other points I just want to comment on.
That's quite a biblical statement, by the way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Building on sand.
I'm sure it is. When you mentioned then WEF and human rights and everything, they're portraying everything's going to get worse and less humans. This is basically a continuation of most religions. You've got to join our religion because on Judgment Day, you're going to hell if you don't. That's why poor people are always more attracted to religions, because it gives them comfort, because their lives are awful and they know what's coming may be better once they've died. So this is a psychology of religion, psychology of socialism. That's why we're always trying to build the utopia. Something inside us likes that and will buy into that. When we talk about nationhood, you talked about heroes, and I think you're spot on there. Where are the English British heroes? They
Yeah,
don't exist anymore now, because if you can make a country reject its heroes, there's no one else to look up to. You can easily defeat that nation. 15 years ago, Winston Churchill, in a huge UK poll, was voted the greatest Briton ever.
yeah,
Today, something like 50% of the population today thinks he's a racist and was almost as bad as Hitler.
yeah,
In 15 years, that's the fall of our greatest hero ever.
yeah,
When we look at other heroes we used to have, some of our explorers, people from the Empire, they're all being denigrated now. And that's because a nation without heroes is easily defeated. And that's why that's being done. So we've got to be really careful about that. We need to raise up our heroes.
yeah,
No heroes are flawless. The humans, they will have flaws, but it's not about their flaws. It's about the amazing things they did for this country.
yeah,
That's why we celebrate them.
yeah. I think that's interesting. Yeah, and I think when I look at the psychology of this, I think the difference between building on sand is actually, I think that one of the things has been realised. In fact, even bloody Klaus Schwab book, The Great Reset, they openly talk about how it was a test to manipulate people. And there's a lot of things that have happened as a consequence of that, and actually they're all indemnified, legally indemnified against anything that they do. So if everybody dies of the COVID vaccine, they have no legal indemnity whatsoever. So I think the it's vitally important that we recognize how we have been manipulated over the last sort of COVID period. And I'm not saying I've got it, but I've looked at some of the elements of that. Um, and a bit like the post office scandal, to make sure it doesn't happen again. Um, because what concerns me, Nick, is that we are quite easy to manipulate. And as human beings, we specific examples are both Trump and Boris Johnson, like them or like them not, initially went along with the COVID. They both pushed back and said COVID was a load of rubbish. And in fact, a lot of what Trump said around ivermectin and the rest of it actually was the right solution.
Mm.
And in fact, if you look at the psychology of what's driving the mRNA vaccine, the only way they could get away with that was to basically poo-poo everything else. So there was only one solution. Therefore, they could impose emergency legislation. So, and Boris Johnson was the same, but they both got carried along. Net zero is another bit of lunacy, which there was a vote in Parliament recently or a little while ago that around net zero, and only three MPs out of 400, 375, whatever they are, voted against it. Now, and I look at the psychology, I think, and you look at the utter madness that's coming out of, Lammy's mouth describing climate change more dangerous than terrorism, and it's just so absurd. So this sort of psychology, you talked about why do people believe things, and I think there's a danger that people will believe anything. Um,
And that's always been the case, and that will always be the case. We're
well,
not
I'm
we're
I'm
not
not
going to
sure.
change. We're not going to change human psychology
I know,
over
but
the
I think what
short
has
term.
changed, I think what has changed is are the tools that are available. So, for example, you and I are talking on this medium, right?
Mm,
This medium goes out
mm.
and it's get fed through a whole raft of algorithms, and um, either be presented to the world or not, for whatever reason. And so I think there are tools and techniques, and you look at who Pavel from Telegram who got locked up, and Musk is, because liars fundamentally, if what we're saying is liars are in charge, let's say exaggerated to make the point, then they will do everything they possibly can to protect their lies, and that means silencing people. So Musk is severely. I mean, Twitter is probably the only bastion
Yeah,
uh, of some sort of, I wouldn't say truth, but truth is a journey, I think, rather than a destination. It's a means to challenge your own thinking. And I find it. You do find conflicting views on Twitter. I mean, which not Twitter X,
yeah.
um, which I
Twitter is
think is,
basically Twitter's free speech.
yeah,
It's full of lies, misinformation, rubbish,
yeah,
conspiracy theories, and the truth.
yeah,
It's down
exactly,
to us to take personal responsibility
yeah,
and work out what is what.
yeah,
Once we start saying, right, we don't want misinformation, we don't want lies, we don't want propaganda. Well, who decides what's propaganda, what's lies, what's misinformation?
yeah.
And they will include some of the truth in that. So you have to have it all, or you have none of it. And I would rather have it all, and I will
I
work
agree.
out what the truth is.
Totally, but I think that's not necessary. If you look at the legislation that the EU Commission are pushing forwards, old
Yeah,
Ursula, which I think she's about as corrupt as anybody I've ever come across. Um, no, she is effectively saying you can do what the hell you like, tech platforms, as long as you silent, as long as you do this, that, and the other, which is
yeah.
effectively actually eliminating, that variety of views, be it right or wrong. Um, and actually, that in its own right is, it's the means of maintaining. It's a license for atrocity, right? That is the way atrocities take place, by controlling the dialogue and silencing the truth tellers. And there's plenty of precedents for that. So I think I would, I observed that some of these tools, in going back to, I mean, I do believe totally what you're saying. The normal course of events is very clear to me that people like Hitler came to power, they're built on sand, and they're going to get destroyed somehow. And I think that's basic battle between good and evil. You use the word, your building on sand is a very biblical statement. Um, but I think there are tools and techniques now to do what Hitler did, and a whole lot more um, rigorous, more inflammatory type of way to ramp up the dialogue,
There is. But
and
on the
control
flip
people.
side of that, there's also a lot more tools for people to fight back against that.
Yeah, yeah, true. Yeah, true. So no, I think that's been really interesting. So, in a nutshell, Nick, I mean, do you agree with my point that it's difficult? Part of the reason why it's difficult to pin down what is British is because there's a large element of freedom. And I think as well rebelliousness, because you and I in our own way are relatively rebellious, aren't we?
Yeah,
We're not conformist, are we? And I think that's a British trait. Um, it's that, the mad dog English, you know,
yeah.
um, you go to the back end of Africa in some really outrageously dangerous place, you always find a Brit. It's
Mm,
like, what are you doing here?
yeah. Just like
Um,
that saying, only mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun.
yeah, so I think there's an element of rebelliousness as well. So I think there's in that freedom and rebelliousness, which comes with, of course, freedom is gives a license to rebel. Um, do you think that's part of the reason why it's difficult to define what British is?
No, I think
Okay.
I think it's down to the fact that we now attack the nation. Unless you believe in a nation, unless you believe in England, how can you be English? If you don't believe in Britain, how can you be British? So I think that's destroyed the essence of it. I go back to my first point. I think it's also the fact that all Western countries now are all coming together and there's hardly any differences between them. So that's blurred the lines. But I think you're right. One of your first points you made, it's down to the invasion of this country,
Yeah.
politically, culturally, physically, and politically.
Yeah.
That now has destroyed any sense of belonging because how can you have a world power, a world government, no borders, if you still allow people to identify to a piece of land? That
Yeah.
has to stop. Otherwise, we can't have a world socialist utopia. And I
Yeah.
think that's the crux of it for me.
Yeah. And I think, well, I totally agree with your first point about nationhood and protecting nationhood. But the question I was, the thing I was, the point I was trying to make was if you're protecting Britishness or Englishness, whatever it is. Um, by the way, well, anyway, we won't talk about that. Then I think it's just a question of trying to put in a bottle what Britishness is. That was the point I was making. I
Yeah.
was saying if you're trying to bottle Britishness, whatever that is, right? Whatever the traits are, whatever the tenets are, there's some truths and other things we've talked about. Um, then if it's difficult to define because it's based around our basic freedom, right? So you and I are British. We are British because we're relatively free, right? That then becomes inherent trait, which is quite unique. And with freedom, you do need to create a certain framework to allow, the rules of the game to allow freedom, right? Part of which is politeness, part of which is queuing, part of which is, you know, all the basic tenets of what's true and what's not true, what's good, what's wrong.
I,
Um,
I don't think I don't think it's freedom. I think for me, so let's say Starmer turns into Stalin. He's halfway there, but let's say he goes
yeah,
full Stalin,
yeah,
and suddenly we're not free.
yeah,
We're still English.
yeah.
So I don't think it's to do with freedom. We didn't get the right to vote up to 100 years ago. Does that mean before that Englishmen weren't English or weren't British? I don't
No,
think
I
it's
agree with
freedom.
that, but I
Yeah.
would question whether or not what Starmer's doing is British, right? I would, because of the reasons it's not, the trait part of which is freedom. Starmer is certainly not an advocate of freedom,
No.
so I would say he's anti-British.
I think freedom comes into what we believe. Maybe one of the minor points of being English and British in the values. Um, I think we cling to that because, like, we cling to democracy, but we would still be English, we would still be British, we'd still feel English and British without freedom, without democracy. That's why I don't hold too much onto that point.
Yeah, I do. I understand your point. Okay, I understand your point. Okay. So in terms of sort of what what we do, we talked a bit about the post office scandal and truth
Mm,
to try and unwind this stuff. I mean, I personally realised that I wasn't using the word invasion,
mm.
and I think we do need to get to that degree of truthfulness in order to address the issue. Um, and that's an invasion on all fronts. I mean, what do you think the you know the are the things we need to do on a daily basis to take personal individual. No, you and I are individuals, Nick.
Yeah.
We face various challenges in our day. How do we conduct ourselves so we're not we're not fueling this problem and we're
Yeah.
actually being part of a solution?
Good question. Coincidentally, I've almost finished my fourth book, should be out next month.
Great.
And I'm just working on the last chapter. And the last chapter is about that question. And the title of the book is called England, My England. So
Oh,
so the last chapter is all about what can you do as an individual to save this great country because it's dying.
yeah,
And we can't expect people to all be charging the machine gun nests and being killed and losing their jobs and their careers and their family and being destitute. That's too much to ask from most people. Some people will do that,
yeah,
but most people won't. So I'm writing a chapter on what they can do as individuals. So I give
right.
examples such as if you're working for a woke corporate organization, well, you've got to be careful what you say because
Yeah,
you'll lose your job. And let's not have you losing your job in this fight at the moment.
okay.
But you can be sneaky. You can talk to your family and friends in the pub. And when one of them is saying, "Oh, trans women are women," well, you say trans women are men who
Yeah,
pretend to be women,
yeah,
and leave it at that. Don't debate them because you probably won't win the debate because you've not got enough information, the skill to do it. State facts.
yeah,
People can't debate facts.
yeah,
If people say to you, "Oh, we're DEI," no, DEI is racist
yeah,
because it prioritizes people based on race.
yeah,
That's racist.
yeah,
So there's things you can say, and if you can convert to your friends, to your family, and they not convert, you give them courage for them to speak out. I don't want to convert anybody because I tell you now, the vast majority of people agree with us. They just haven't got the courage and the
yeah,
bravery to talk about it. So they're being sheep and they're going along with it. But if we can encourage them to be slightly braver
yeah,
and they just add a millimeter to the fight,
yeah,
and you add up those 40 million people, that's a tsunami of support that can change things.
yeah,
And I'm saying to people, doing nothing is not an option. You've got to work out in your life, in the way you move in the world, within your resources, what can you do to contribute to the fight and to common sense. And
yeah,
you work out what it is and you do it because doing nothing isn't an option anymore.
yeah. No, I think that's great. I think I'm a great believer. Social media, I think it is a it's an important tool, but I
Mm.
think the rubber hits the ground in the face-to-face interactions we have on a daily basis, Nick.
Mm.
Um, and I think it's very important to not to assume we're going to change the world on Twitter, because it comes down to actually physically things changing, and a large part of what you're talking about, encouraging people to step over the edge, face to face, which certainly is something I do quite provocatively in my own dialogue at my own cost quite often.
Mm.
Uh, I think the other thing is as well that there's an element of unwinding the lies. So, Tommy Robinson is the most ridiculously slandered. And we talked about, I think when you mentioned who's a national hero, I think there's an element of him, right, in terms of his bravery. There's an element of him being a sort of true Brit to a degree. Um, and actually, what's interesting is when, particularly the police are actually policing um, anti Tommy Robinson stuff to watch what the police are looking at. But what's interesting is the police are becoming aware actually that he's not a racist. He's a genuinely relatively decent bloke with an interesting history. And once that awareness takes over, and once you become aware of the fear that's associated with being honest and overstepping the mark and avoiding the fear of being accused falsely of being racist or um, using the inflammatory dialogue, then um, I think we're going to start making progress. But I think a lot of the incentives currently, if you take the army, if you take John Lewis, if you take the
Yeah.
Bank of England, it's a lot of the challenge is that and I think this is part of the problem with Starmer. He will tend to reignite this thing. So whilst the Sue Gray report, kiboshed a lot of some stuff, I think the fact Starmer's back in control is a bit concerning in terms of reigniting some of these fires that should have been put out. Um, so, but I do think,
I look forward to him reigniting these fires
yeah,
because once you start a fire, you can't control it.
yeah,
And he's going to burn himself. He's already doing it with the free gifts he's accepting and stuff for his wife and people
yes,
buying him clothes. That is the biggest mistake he's made up to now, because that's a judgment on his morality.
yeah, I agree.
Other stuff he's done, you could actually say he was misinformed. It's his ideology. He's looking for the greater good. And even though I disagree with those things, but you could make a point to a certain extent. His latest things is all down his morality. And when you were talking about heroes, most heroes are not classed as heroes until long after they're dead.
Yeah, true.
And I think Tommy Robinson will be seen in much better light 50 years from now.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. Yeah, I think the last point I'd make, which is a bit of a spiritual point, is the devil has no shame, right?
Mm.
So this stuff that you've just described gets exposed, uh, and it also, if you give the devil an inch, you take a mile, and actually
Mm.
it then accelerates. And so your logic is true in so much that it will be exposed, it will be accelerated, and there will come a point whereby people say, those people who are sitting on the fence will say no. Enough is enough. And I think we are, well, even in the even in the short term of Starmer's 50 days or 70 days,
Yeah,
whatever it is.
70 days now. Let me give you an example of how much trouble he's in, which I didn't realize till 2 days ago. 2 days ago, I found myself liking and reposting tweets from people like, I forget the names now, far left lunatics, I would normally class them. So the Asian woman who's a communist who was on TV going, I'm literally a communist. And Sakara, something like that, she's called.
Yeah.
She's putting tweets out. I'm going, about Starmer, and I'm going, I agree with everything she's just said.
Yeah. It's
So some crazy Islamist MP.
Yeah.
She puts, and I'm retweeting her going, I agree with everything she's putting out today.
Yeah.
That's how crazy this is getting. And
Yeah.
that's how I know Starmer can't last very long, because he's uniting everybody against him. And someone like me is agreeing with the far left lunatics over his morality, then he's in big trouble.
Yeah. I mean, by the way, part of the winning thinking, that's a sign of a healthy mind, by the way, Nick, because rather than look at that person far left in the bin, they are this, that, and the other, you've actually taken the time to this is very much a British trait, taking the time to actually listen to what they say, and take it on board and challenge yourself and actually agree with it.
And then tell everybody else, I agree with this person.
I know, and I do think, because that's very interesting. Yeah, and I think that's probably a good point to end on, which is let's not, let's set the example of not labeling people. I think left and right labels are disastrous. I'd really try very hard to avoid labeling people because it fuels the fire. And what we do need to get to is to listen to what people are saying, value difference, acknowledge difference, park it, learn if there is something to learn, but with a view of developing relationships and maintaining relationships, because the alternative, if you're labeling up front, is conflict. So, and that is a deeply British thing, deeply British, I think, is that grace, to take an interest in what someone's saying and giving them the love to speak, is so we can, really good. That's a really good point to finish on, Nick. So good job. Good to see you, my friend. Let's stoke the fire with something else in the not too distant future.
Excellent. I enjoyed that. Cheers.
Cheers, Nick. Bye.